Good evening. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be looking at writing about unpublished sources using a conflict management assignment as our focus here. If you are new to the ACU Online Writing Center, we work with students at any point in the writing process. You could be just looking at the instructions and wondering where to begin. You could be working out a thesis statement or a paragraph or a page or a whole draft and anywhere in between, and you're more than welcome to come to us for assistance. We do not charge for our services. We are a tuition perk, if you will. Your student fees cover what we do, and so you can visit us up to twice per week with no charge and have a half an hour or 1 hour appointment. Most students work with us to what we call asynchronous appointments, which is to say you schedule a time for your appointment. By the time that appointment rolls around, you upload a copy of your paper, and we send you feedback via email within 24 hours normally. If you are emailing us on Easter weekend, which is coming up pretty soon, it might be slightly longer than that, but we try and keep it to that 24-hour thing as much as possible. And of course, if you have a paper deadline coming up, that is outside of the normal realm, please let us know. If you are submitting a paper for feedback on Monday morning, we try and get that feedback to you by after lunch so that you have time to work on that. And similarly, at the end of the term, because most papers are due on Friday, if you have a draft you send to us to Friday morning, we'll get that back to you, as quickly as we can so that you have time to respond to the feedback. If for some reason you have something you'd like to ask via phone, perhaps you want to ask a string of questions, or your professor has given you a list of things to work on that you'd like to have a conversation about, you can request a phone or Zoom appointment by sending us an email at the address you see on my screen. And we also do many webinars like this and have other resources, paper templates, blog posts, answers to frequently asked questions, and sample papers on the Online Writing Center website. Again, the general process for making an appointment with us, you schedule an appointment using the WC Online software. Then you upload a copy of your paper to Canvas by the time that the appointment comes around, and then we will send you feedback via email, usually within 24 hours. Coming up later this evening, this is probably going to be a shorter webinar today. When I've taught things on this general topic before, usually, unless people have a lot of questions, we finish with a little time to spare. So those of you who are continuing on to lecture at 7 o'clock, don't worry, you'll have time to do a bathroom break. But we are also doing a EDD in Progress webinar on article discoveries starting at 7 o'clock this evening. Then we have a few more webinars left on our schedule for the rest of the term, and we'll have a whole bunch of new ones coming in summer one, including a number of brand new ones, especially for CONR students. All right, here are some of the resources that I'm going to be referring to today. If you have a question about them, please feel free to ask. If you did not RSVP for the webinar and you would like a copy of the slide deck or the recording, just type your email address in the chat room and I'll be happy to add you to the list. We record all of our webinars and we make those available. We send a email with a link to everyone who RSVP'd, anyone who asked in the webinar or afterwards, and then we also post them to the Writing Center website. We have a growing body of videos on our YouTube channel, so if you are, say, waiting in line and you want to watch part of one of our lectures, that's certainly possible. I do not recommend trying to drive and watch. I had a student once who was looking at their paper at traffic lights, and I said, let's schedule another time. But if you have some time to kill and you want to watch one of our videos, awesome. All right, we have two main objectives for today. One is to understand the APA rules about citing unpublished sources. And the second is to look specifically at the expectations for an assignment that is due this week in CONR 604, the Reflecting, Reframing, and Summarizing assignment. I encourage questions as we go along. If there's anything that you're curious about, you didn't find clear, that you would like me to repeat, just send me a question. You can send me a question as a private message if you don't feel comfortable asking it in the public chat. but there are no bad questions, only questions that you ask. All right, so let's talk about the APA rules for citing unpublished sources. And it's helpful to understand that the distinction between what APA considers published, what it considers unpublished, and the middle ground that you sometimes have where, well, it could kind of go both ways. So generally speaking, with published sources, you're going to be citing those using in-text citations and listing them in the reference section. So if there's a journal article, yeah, you're going to cite it and it'll be in your references section. There's a textbook, yep, you'll cite it and you'll have a reference in it. Website, same deal. Now, what happens if you have something where you have a unpublished paper or there's an advanced pre-press version of an article? And this sometimes happens with breaking research. Those of you who have been following the news at all for the last year with the pandemic, a lot of the scientific literature related to COVID-19 has been made available in a pre-press fashion where it's available online, sometimes even from the journal website, but there are notes on it saying, this is still in the process of being approved. It may be edited, it may change, but that is an example of something where, because the published version is in the works and it is accessible, then you would cite it and list it in your references section, even though technically it hasn't been published in its final form just yet. So this leads us to an understanding of when the published source rules apply. If the document can be publicly accessed and downloaded, or the data set or whatever it is, this counts as published as far as the requirement to use the citing and referencing rules. Dissertations and theses. So there are some companies that will publish your dissertation as a book, and they will sell copies to people. But there are also databases like ACU's own Research Commons, where you can just go ahead and download the dissertation as submitted. So that's an example of informally published, or some would say unpublished, but you still follow the basic rules for you have to cite and list it in your reference section, just as if it was a formally published source. YouTube, other online video services, podcasts, data sets, social media posts, all of those would get both a citation and a reference. So general rule of thumb, if you can find it online, it's usually something that you're going to be citing and referencing if it were a published source. Includes those papers and dissertation manuscripts we talked about earlier. And now let's turn our page to those unpublished sources. So the unpublished sources, this is referring to things that cannot be retrieved by someone else or cannot be retrieved under normal circumstances. So my emails are not available to the public. An in-person conversation that you or I might have, that's not something that is normally available, where it's not something people can just go and download and read through or listen to. Internal organizational documents that aren't in some archive that you can go in and access. And I will say that there are some gray areas. We'll talk about those in a little bit. A personal interview that you conduct with someone. A printed flyer. If you do a survey and you collect data from people, that survey data, unless it's made available somewhere where you can download it, it's be considered an unpublished source. Phone calls, text messages, unpublished letters. Now, if these things get written down and published somewhere, then we move over to the published category. So, for example, a number of political figures have donated their email archives to museums and libraries, and those get published and made available online, in which case they can be retrieved. So we then going to go treat them as a published source. Similarly, if I was to transcribe a conversation and publish it on, let's say, the Atlantic magazine website, then that would now be a published thing, and we'd treat it like that. So it's those things that other people can't access that we're really considering as unpublished sources. So for unpublished source, most of these you'll cite using an in-text parenthetical citation. And we just cite it as a personal communication. Okay, something that was said or otherwise conveyed to you. And you want to give the name or other identifying information. If you're doing work on a company, you might say the vice president instead of their name. Uh, but we're identifying, okay, who stated this information? It was communicated to you how? Oh, personal communication. And when? Month, day, and year. So the company lost $432,000 in the last quarter. Parenthetical citation, G. Smith, personal communication, May 12, 2020. And if we're using that as a signal phrase, then it's the same basic information. Who wrote it? How did it go out? When did this communication take place? So G. Smith, citation, personal communication, May 12, 2020, close parentheses, stated that the company lost $432,000 in the last quarter. Both of these are correct. Now, a personal interview, an interview you conduct with someone, would normally be cited as a personal communication. There are some exceptions. So if you are doing a formal research study, which is probably not applying to you right now if you're in the CONR program. But if you're visiting us from, say, EDD, because you're interested in the topic and you want to know how to cite things, this exception one would apply for you, where interviews with research participants do not require citations because you're reporting the information for the first time in your own paper or publication, like your dissertation. But you should be generally identifying the source. As we can see in this example, two participants stated that they felt more joy from getting iPhones as holiday gifts than when receiving an equivalent amount in cash bonuses. And just as a general reminder to proofread, we can see there's a typo there. So if you run a spell check before submitting, you will catch things like this. So I like to throw one or two of those in as a reminder that all of us should remember to do our due diligence and spell check to save us little typos like that. All right, another exception. When discussing a case study or client session, you can introduce an event without providing a citation for every statement. Basically, if you make it obvious in the paragraph who you're talking about or what you're talking about, then you don't need to have that parenthetical citation and everything because you've told the reader this already. For example, in a mediation meeting on March 2nd, 2021, I asked the three clients to explain their perspectives. Jane Doe started by stating, "I think this is a hostile work environment." John Vanderveck immediately interrupted, saying, "This is exactly why I did not want to do this." However, after mediation, the clients agreed to hear each other out and not interrupt. So, yes, these were something of a personal communication. There were things that were being said with you in the room. But because that introductory sentence, the in a mediation meeting on March 2, 2021, has already given that information, it would be redundant to have it in the citation again for this paragraph. All right. Now, as I said earlier, if the information gets published somewhere, then you move from just referring to it offhand or reporting on it first time to citing it as you would any other resource because it is now published and accessible. In Knowles' 2019 study, two participants stated that they felt more joy from getting iPhones as holiday gifts than receiving an equivalent amount in cash bonuses. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and look at the CONR 604 assignment for this week, the Reflecting, Reframing, and Summarizing assignment. I'm sorry, that is not the right label. Just a moment, let me go and fix that. All right, almost done. There, you should be seeing my screen now again. All right, so we're looking at the reflecting, reframing, and summarizing assignment here. So what does this ask you to do? Well, we have some introductory text about the topic, and then the specific instruction at the end of the first paragraph. In this exercise, you will practice reflecting these statements you might hear in a mediation. And there's the instruction, okay, copy and paste the statements, and then reflect back what they said, and do this for all the statements. Here are the sample statements. I'll read one for effect. He stole my idea. I came up with it, and we discussed it over lunch, and then he went to the head of the department like he came up with it. Now he's up for a promotion, and I get nothing. He's nothing but a backstabbing thief. Hopefully none of you have been in that exact situation. Sounds very uncomfortable. All right, and then there's also the task of summarizing. Summarizing may be the most familiar of the three skills in this exercise. To summarize, you will take everything you have heard from the parties down to a brief statement or list. This will help the parties understand what their interests are and what they need to focus on as the mediation progresses. As the mediator, you will use summaries throughout the process. And then there's mentions there are two podcasts, and in the same word that document they use for the reflecting and reframing exercises, summarize both parties' opening statements and identify those using headings. All right. Got a couple paper specs. So 1100 to 1200 words. So a double spaced page, Times New Roman font, 1-inch margins. That's going to be about 250 words. So we're looking at somewhere roughly 4.5 to 5 pages worth of content here. All right. And there's this specific note at the bottom. Given the nature of the assignment, citing sources and including citations may not be necessary. All right. So those are the instructions. We have a rubric as well that is more or less listing the same thing, saying you need to do these things to get credit. And let us talk about some of the sources that you might be citing. So the instructions again say, citing sources and including citations may not be necessary. And there are ways that you can word this assignment where you won't have any formal citations. But in case you do, in case you are referring back to the course material, you're probably going to be referring to one of these course texts, the Beer and Packard book, the Fisher et al. Book, or the Moore book. And yeah, you can see the example citations here. If we were going to be citing those, it would just be the author's last names in parentheses, comma, and then the publication date. More on that in a little bit. And something we get a lot of questions about at the Writing Center is how to cite podcasts. So I'm going to explain this two different ways. One is if you're going to be referring to this as course material, because most people are accessing this podcast through the course website. And if you're going to do that, you would cite parts 1 and 2 as you see down here, where we have the author, the initial. There's not a date given here, so that's why I have N period, D period. We have more than one thing with the same author with no date given. That's why there's the -A, -B after N period, D period. And then we have the rest of the information. So let's talk about this a little bit and how you might find that. So the first thing to understand is that you don't have to have all the information all the time. So I've seen people cite this and they'll go ahead and they'll put things like access and retrieval dates. You used to need those, by which I mean in APA 6th edition, you needed to have those. But it's very rare when you're required to give an access or retrieval date in APA 7th edition, because we realize that lots of things would change and that there are other ways, like DOIs, of indicating more permanence. Okay, So what's going in here? Well, we have the author, that's the Cope J, that's Joey Cope, a former dean of the graduate school. And period D, period A, okay, so that's no date. This is the first thing with that author and no date. We've got the name of the podcast. Okay, Communication, the Heart of Mediation, Part 1. Then there's a parenthetical note saying it's an audio podcast. And then where did you find it? Oh, in the course website. And then the link for that. All right. Now, if that was the only place that you got the podcast, that would be the end of it. It's not as helpful if you are publishing your research, your writing in a journal, because no one who is not at ACU will be able to access it. People at ACU will, but not someone who is say, working at Texas Tech University, say. So it happens that these podcasts, before we started the online graduate program here, Dean Cope published these as a podcast through iTunes University. And so you can access them through iTunes today and through other platforms. Now, if you go to iTunes and look at this podcast, you'll see that, oh, his middle name is listed, which is why, based on that particular publication, we would have Cope, J period, L period, because it gave the middle name, and therefore we include an initial for it. You'll note that the date, that's 2007A, so it's the first source by this author published in 2007 to come up alphabetically. And then we also have the month and the day. And this is something that, newspaper articles and podcasts and YouTube videos and things like that have that sort of publication structure that we would mark. If this was just a journal article, we'd have 2007A. We'd leave out the month and the day. But because content for podcast services and YouTube videos and such is released daily, it is important to track that and understand when did this come out. So if something happens to be published and people can access it, this is the preferred method for referencing this, because someone who is not at ACU would be able to actually access and retrieve this and look at what you found. So how do you decide, or how do you know when something is unpublished, that you have an unpublished source being used? Well, if you're looking at transcript or notes and people's names aren't being given, that's a fairly good lead. That there's no specific date or situation provided. This comes up a lot when you're writing about case studies. And they're being referred to in text. And so there are no parenthetical citations or references being given for the statements. So that's probably unpublished material. So what if we were going to look at something like this statement here? Well, how would we reference it as an unpublished source? Well, we don't need that citation. It's that you're being given the prompt. You don't have a particular day when this conversation took place. So you write about it generally, as you see in the first example. If a client stated complaint, 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 close quotation, I would reflect this statement by stating, etc., etc., etc. Or this next one, if a client stated, he stole my idea, I came up with it and we discussed it over lunch, etc., 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 I would restate this as. And so you've introduced the hypothetical statement, and you have identified the hypothetical statement using quotation marks, and then you've transitioned, I would restate this as, or I would reflect this as. All right. So let's do this next thing. We're going to move into the hands-on portion. And I did say we'll give you some time to spare this evening, so we won't take too long at this, but I find is very helpful to move into specifics and look at this in practice. So I'm going to shift my sharing now here, and I have gone ahead and I have a copy of the APA course paper template here. And when you get the template, it comes with some instructional comments and such. I can go ahead and delete these easily. Go to Review, Delete all comments in Document. There, all those comments are gone. And I can go ahead and fill in the name of my paper here. What's it going to be this time? Well, this is a reflecting, reframing, and summarizing assignment. I'm not feeling very original this evening, so I'm just going to go ahead and paste that here as unformatted text. And just call it Reflecting, Reframing, and Summarizing Assignment. It's not fancy, but it is informative. In an APA style, it's better to be clear about what you're stating rather than have to try to make this sound poetic or original and have people not sure what it is you're trying to say. So you'd go in and fill in your name. Instructor, the date, etc., etc. By the way, please let me know if the text size is a little bit small and harder to read. So we have here an abstract. Now, abstracts get used in some assignments, usually as you get near the end of your coursework. And if you're a doctoral student, you need to write an abstract before your dissertation or doctoral study is published. But unless your instructor tells you you must include an abstract, you don't need to. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to delete these pages right away. And we have, all right, our paper here. This is where we'll start. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. And, oh, I need to remember to have my same title on both pages. Both the title little page and on the first page of the body here. All right, so what am I being asked to do? Well, we're going to go ahead and look at the website version. So let me go ahead and change my screen sharing here. All right, so we have 5 statements that we'll need to repeat. And we don't have a clear context, but we can provide something or assume something here. So the instruction is telling us, following the statement, as the mediator, you should reflect back what the party said, repeat for each of the 5 statements. And there's a very similar instruction down here where you are supposed to reframe it using de-escalating language, validate their underlying interests, and offer a new perspective. So fundamentally, it's the same. You're telling people, okay, here's what I understand, here's what you're telling me, and then use that to get some agreement to move on. So let's take one of these examples here. And there are a few ways that you can format this. And I'm going to show you one that I do not recommend first, because I don't recommend it because it tends to be less than what professors are expecting. And I'd rather that you look at that and say, okay, I need to write some more, rather than having to make that decision after you get your paper back and see the grade. So I'm going to go ahead and change my screen sharing here. So we're now looking in Microsoft Word. And we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to paste this question here. All right, so we have the quote. And so now we want to contextualize it. And we haven't been given a specific date, time, and place, or even the speaker. So let's map it onto our context. Now, sometimes people will kind of wrap themselves in trying to find the perfect prose. Clients often get emotional. Because of this, a client who said he stole my idea. And you could spend a lot of time on that, but really what you want to do is point out, okay, if someone said this to me, here's what I would say back to them as a client. So, do you need a fancy introduction? No. Uh, you probably want this to be fitting within a paragraph, not just be a quote and then response, because you are, after all, writing a paper. But do we need something fancier than to say, well, they said this and I did this? No. All right, so let's take that angle here. The client said to me, or if a client meeting with me about a coworker said, I would reflect this statement, and then you get to do that reflection there. You could also go ahead and say, okay, well, here's what I'm looking out for, or these would be my concerns, and then because of this, I would. So let's go ahead and take another example and show this. All right, so neighbor tensions are frequent in my neighborhood and require that you act impartial. For example, if my neighbor said to me, they never mow their lawn or take care of the yard, their house makes the whole neighborhood look bad, etc., etc., I would try to call them down before saying, and then you give your recommendation. Now, you'll see that both of these involve me statements, because one of the professional conceits is that usually you in CONR you are imagining yourself as the therapist in the room, and that it is a question of what you will do, what actions you are asked to do. And that's totally fine. If you choose this route, just make sure that you keep the focus by and large on the thing that you're trying to describe. So, all right, let's go look at those slides again. Or no, let's look at the assignment page. So if we go ahead and we look at this example here, she may be my sister, but she knows that grandma wanted me to have the silver. Ooh, family arguing over possessions after someone has died. That is a great drama. I would prefer not to be in any part of it. So we have a couple things that we're supposed to do. So you need to list the original statement, reframe it by using de-escalating language that validates the underlying interests and offer a new perspective. All right, let's take that one here. All right, so we've got the original text here. All right, sometimes clients make very personal statements such as, she may be my sister, but she knows that grandma wanted me to have the silver, etc. And then, okay, tell the reader what you're going to do and why. All right, well, we need to reframe this by using de-escalating language, validating the underlying interests, and offering a new perspective. Okay, so reframing. What's the reframing? Well, you're changing the perspective on it, and you are trying to de-escalate this. So, okay. Um, so you can just phrase it as I would, or another way that you could phrase this is to say a conflict manager, and assume the professional role and describe what anyone in this role should do. All right, a conflict manager should first acknowledge the familial connection while reframing the statement. Now, here's another one that comes up. So E period, G period. This stands for Latin phrase meaning more or less, for example. And there's an APA rule that when you use that, it should always be in parentheses. Well, in this case, we're talking about something that's key to the sentence's importance, so I don't think we're going to put it in parentheses because it's that important. So we'll just write that out as for example. All right. All right, and remember, we're being asked to reframe this. And now I'm going to suggest some things that you should probably not do, because, of course, it's ultimately up to you to write this assignment. I understand that you are upset and feel very strong about this situation. However, your sister is smarter than you, and Grandma probably thought she would be more responsible. Please don't do this in your conflict management sessions, but you get the idea of you're reframing the statement. You're repeating some elements of this back to the speaker. You're acknowledging you have heard them, but you're changing the perspective. Now, there's actually a conflict resolution and tactic that some people use where the whole point is to get people upset with a therapist and not with a family. I do not believe we teach that particular approach at ACU, among other things, because it's usually bad for business if your clients don't come back because they agree you're the problem. But it does get used in some approaches. So where those other citations that we're talking about would probably come in, where you might be using the references, if you're saying, oh, I would say it this way because so-and-so recommended. And it's when you're grounding your commentary, when you're saying, oh, I'm doing this in alignment with this, that is when you start having citations, because you don't need citations to refer to these texts. You're just giving examples of what people might say, And as you can see, we can package those just fine without having to have a formal citation. But if you're saying, so-and-so recommended doing this, therefore I will do that, well, that's when we would want a citation. So, for example, and let's see which, let's refer to the Beer and Packard book. Packard 2012 recommended de-escalation. And so on and so forth. And of course, we would then go ahead and we would want to have a copy in the reference section. So let's head down there. And there we go. Now, something to keep in mind. We've been talking about unpublished sources. So unpublished sources, of course, won't have something in the reference section because no one can look them up. But with these published sources, you do want to be careful about how you are referring to them, and whether it is clear what they are saying versus what you are saying. So in the text I showed you earlier, and again, I don't recommend saying things to make the family angry with you, but this is saying, oh, they made this recommendation. In my professional experience, something else is the case. And then give us a logical bridge, like, therefore, I have chosen language that will antagonize. So you explain those things that you're doing. So if you are going ahead and you are running through that list and you're talking about how you're reframing it using de-escalating language, validating the underlying interests, and offering the new perspective, label that. And if that is coming because you're following a particular set of guidance or something said in a podcast, just let us know. Most of the time, if it's something that was just said out loud and not recorded, then it's going to be just treated as a personal communication. If it's something that was recorded, it usually ends up being cited and appearing in your reference list. Now, I promised you that we will be finishing relatively early today, and so this is our pausing point. If you are heading off to a lecture class at 7 o'clock, I'd say this is a great time to take a break, do the things you need to do, and we will send a copy of the recording and the slide deck to everyone who RSVP'd and who wrote me with their email address. That'll go out after I finish the next webinar. If you are attending and you are planning on continuing over to the next webinar, we're going to take a 15-minute break.